Hello and welcome to our session today on developing a critical mindset and action in library teaching with Darren Flynn. My name is Alex and I'm the Student and New Professionals Officer for the cilip.london Members Network. Today our session will be led by Darren, Academic Liaison Manager at the University of Northampton and a practitioner in critical library teaching. Through this session we'll aim to explore power structures and consider the role of authority in library teaching. As always, please feel free to put any questions or comments throughout in the chat and use that as a space for discussion as you like. And just finally, we'd like to note that this session, like all of our online events, will be recorded and uploaded to the cilip.london YouTube page for later viewing. And a link to that recording will be circulated to all attendees next week. So without any further introduction from me, over to you, Darren.
Thanks, Alex. So, hi folks. So I'm just going to share my screen. Oh, you might just need to give me permission to do that.
Yep, sorry, I'll just do that now.
And I'll get my slides up. Okay, you should now be able to see my slides if I just go to full screen. I'll just pop that over there. Okay, so hi everybody. So as we said, my name is Darren Flynn and I'm the Academic Liaison Manager at the University of Northampton. So I manage a small team of academic librarians, but most of what I'm going to be talking about today and most of the practices that I'm going to be talking about, I actually developed more in previous roles where I was a teaching librarian. So that was in the 11 to 18 school sector, the HE sector, and then as a health librarian working at a university. So I've been interested in sort of critical library practice for a few years now. And for me, what it's really helped me to do is to sort of articulate and formalize a lot of the other pedagogy that I use as a teacher. I wrote one of the chapters in Jess Haig and Elizabeth Brookbank's edited collection on critical library practice, and that's how I've sort of come to be here today talking to you. Outside of my day job, so outside of my core sort of paid role, I'm also the co-chair of the Critical Approaches to Libraries conference, and because that's coming up in a couple of months, I just feel kind of compelled to give a little plug for that as well, if anyone's interested in attending that in a couple of months' time. Or in fact, even putting in a paper, the call for paper closes on Sunday. So, today I'm talking about my thoughts on being a critical teaching librarian, and I've tried to, and how I've tried to go about doing that through sort of democratic processes in the classroom. I kind of wanted to say from the get-go that in this session I'm going to be talking about democracy and authoritarianism, and I did over the past couple of weeks really reflect on how appropriate that would be right now, given we have a nascent democracy in Europe that's under attack by an authoritarian regime. And I did wonder how appropriate it was to be talking about democracy in terms of voting in a library classroom and giving a lecture as being an authoritarian behaviour, and whether that was really appropriate. But I did think that actually it's important that, you know, we still do carry on talking about these things at that very low level and not draw that link. So I am using those terms, but it's democracy with a small d and authoritarian with a lowercase a. And I'm using those terms primarily just because that's what tends to be used in the literature. So I think it's also important that I just talk a little bit around my positionality, because a lot of these characteristics about me really inform both the perspective I give and also my practice. So I want to acknowledge that when I discuss what I do, what I don't do, what choices I make in the classroom, I'm the beneficiary of a large degree of privilege in that. I'm a white, cis male, non-disabled, native English speaker, and in the country that I live, I have secure residence. My practice is also informed by the fact that I'm from a working class background and I'm the first person in my family to receive any education over the age of 16. And that gives me a very particular perspective on higher education that is at times sort of inherently critical and sometimes can be a little bit cynical when it comes to looking at the practices that I see in higher education. So that's sort of where I'm coming from when I discuss this. That's something that I think is important to be open about. I also, just before we kick off on the main bit of the session, just talk a little bit around a run through of how I'm going to run this session. So in terms of the format of the session, it is more of a presentation than a workshop or a lesson. So it is pretty sort of talk. I am going to ask for a little bit of interaction, but it's going to be very low input. I'm just going to ask you to put some answers into the chat, and it's all going to be individual. So you can obviously engage with each other, but there's not an expectation that you do that. I'd also just point out that reflection, either now during the session or later afterwards, on any of the topics raised is also interaction. So if you're not interacting via the chat, you can interact via reflection afterwards. If you have any questions during the session, do feel free to put them in the chat box, and I'll try and check in on it as and when I can, and I'll try and pick them up. If I don't answer your question as it's come along, it's probably because I haven't had a chance to read it yet, or it could be that I'm covering that point later in the session. At the end, I hope to have a bit of time for questions at the end, and at which point you can unmute yourself, or we can use the chat box for that. And then lastly, just in terms of my knowledge in this area, I am by no means a scholar of critical practice, critical library practice. I'm very much coming at this as an interested and enthusiastic non-expert when it comes to critical practice. So a lot of this is based on reading that I've done and things that I've tried out. When it comes to library teaching and information literacy, I'm on much firmer ground, and that's something that I've had quite a lot of experience of in my career. So that's all the sort of preamble. In terms of the actual session itself, so I put into the session that I wanted to look at power in library teaching. And one of the reasons for that is a lot of sessions that I've been to on critical library practice, on critical library pedagogy, a really quite common question that comes out is just simply, what is it? Or how would you define that? And I'm not really surprised by that question at all, because it can be a really slippery concept, and it's a really adaptable concept as a sort of body of thought. So I think you could get 5 experts on critical library practice together, and you would still get 5 different definitions of what it actually is. For my purposes and the way that I think about it, I try and sort of sum it up as critical library practice is about being interested in power and in power dynamics. So it's an interest in who has power in a particular space or a particular sphere or a particular context. What do they do with that power? And then how do they express, how do they use that power with the people around them? So when I'm looking at being critical as a teaching librarian, what I'm really interested in is exploring those different power dynamics that are in play in that really specific educational context of a library classroom. By library classroom, I mean both the physical space and just that experience of teaching as a librarian. So this is the first bit that I'm going to ask you to do a little bit of interaction with me. So what I'd like you to do is in the chat, I just want to build on that idea of power dynamics and get some thoughts from you. So in the chat box, what I'd like you to do is to put in 1 or 2 words that answers this question. What or who exerts power over you in your library classroom? So if you haven't previously or don't currently teach as part of your role, please feel free to respond sort of hypothetically, or reply or respond to any of the other comments. I'm going to give you about a minute to do that, and then just have a look at some of your responses. And then I'll give you sort of my thoughts on that as well. Okay. Give you about a minute starting now. Okay, so I make that about a minute. So if we just have a look at some of the responses that we got here, a real mix of things, but actually some quite common themes coming in here. So we've got sort of academic staff that we work alongside, having power over us, students at times having power over us, and technology. We've got some ones which aren't sort of people, but sort of more conceptual stuff like expectations, fear of getting it wrong, time constraints. And then we've also got some of those sort of institutional things as well. So sort of management structures and sort of the wider institution administration. And in some cases, quite a lot there in terms of just the resourcing that we have in order to do that teaching. So quite a lot of different things there. So that's looking at people or things that have power over us when we're teaching. What I wanted to do now is almost flip that or look downwards and actually say, well, what power do you exert in the library classroom? So if you've got these things which are pushing power down onto you, what do you have when you come to exert power? So the same thing again, I'm going to give you about a minute, and in the chat box, I want you to tell me, when do you feel that you have power or that you exert power, and in what way? Okay, so we've got some stuff in here which is around that actual just being in control of the classroom. So having the choice of who speaks. So when you speak and when you allow other people to speak, and being able to sort of set those boundaries in the classroom. We've got the content that you might be teaching. So you've got control over what you end up teaching and what you choose to focus on. That idea about setting the context and what counts and doesn't count. So you're able to define that for students. And just control over the flow of the session. So when you move on, when you hold back or anything like that. And then this idea as well that I think a few people have come up around authority. And authority is a power that we have in the classroom, being that person who is in charge and who knows the details of stuff. So we've got an idea of where you're coming from in that. Just in terms of my classroom, when I did this with me, this hasn't come up very well on your slides, but I'll talk you through it. So I did the same exercise myself and thought about who has power over me. And the things that I came up with was this one idea, which is, and this is probably the most powerful for me, is this idea of the profession. So that covers a whole range of perceptions, attitudes, behaviors. So it covers and has power over me in how I feel that I should act in a classroom, what good teaching looks like, what sort of approaches or techniques I should use, what language I use, even things like how I dress. That all comes to me sort of from this idea of the profession. And that has a lot of power over me. My management team, they decide a lot of the context in which I teach. So either directly through decisions that are made on what I can teach, if there's any sort of framework or curriculum I have to follow, and any materials I have, but also potentially indirectly as well. So it's management that decides a lot of what my teaching load is going to be like. And obviously if I have a massive teaching load, that is going to really affect how and when I can teach. On a larger level than that, there's also the institution that I work in, and they often are putting certain pressures on me to do things in certain ways, and might even have that sort of codified in certain policies, so that we don't do lectures, or we always do small group teaching, or we always do face-to-face and never online. So that's exerting a lot of power over me. And finally, there's the curriculum for me. So that dictates what I teach, what the conditions are going to be, and how much time I have. So particularly for students, when I'm doing the embedded teaching, what curriculum is really going to decide what I get to do with those students, but just the amount of time that's allocated to me. In terms of my power over students in the classroom, within that space, it's quite a delimited space, but I actually have a lot of power in that area. So I have control over the content, so what gets taught, what gets discussed. I have power over the activities that we do, so what are we going to do during that class, and what form that teaching takes, online, face-to-face lecture, small group, seminar, discussion. And then also, like some of you have said, information over what power over what information I impart on students. So that's going to really change their experience, because I can choose to withhold or give information on certain topics, whether that's my subject area or anything broader than that. So that's what the sort of power dynamics are in my classroom. I also thought it'd be useful just to talk a little bit around my teaching context as well, because this really influences how I can be critical as a teacher. So I'm going to ask again for a little bit of interaction here as well. So I'm going to talk through some different sort of main features of my teaching, particularly when I was a health librarian. And you should have an option to give a reaction. You should have an option where you can put in a reaction, either a hands up or a clap. And what I'd like to do is I just want to get a sense of how much this is common for everybody. So if I say something that resonates with you, if you just put in one of those reactions, and then everybody should be able to see it. So first of all, almost all of my teaching was essentially what we call one-shot teaching. So I went into somebody else's module, I taught a standalone session, and then I left and went out of there. With some programs, I did get to see students multiple times, but it was often quite far apart. So I might see them in the first week and then see them in the second semester and then second and third year if it's undergraduate. So essentially, it was standalone sessions. Now, I rarely, if ever, had that much control over the amount of time I had with students. I could sort of negotiate within certain limits, but I would still have to be very selective about what I did or didn't do. It was relatively rare that I could go in and say, I want to teach these 4 things and I need an hour and a half to do it in. It tended to be more the other way around. You can have an hour with them and then you choose what you're going to do with that hour. So I couldn't always cover everything that I wanted to and had to be really selective about it. All my teaching pretty much was embedded within modules and it had to be curriculum linked. So I did a lot of the stuff that the profession says I should do. So information literacy was embedded on the curriculum for the health areas that I supported, and it formed part of the assignment and the assessment. Although in health it was called evidence-based practice, not information literacy, but it was a bit like pushing an open door. You could get IL onto that curriculum. So they had modules where they could, where they had to describe and carry out a literature search. They'd get feedback and assessment on information literacy topics, and that was all great. The downside of that, though, is if you've used a lot of your sort of persuasion and your liaison work to get IL onto the curriculum and said, yes, we want to be able to assess these things, then you have to make sure that you cover it, because otherwise you're not equipping students to succeed. And what that actually did a lot was limit what I could do in the classroom. And it means for health, it's a lot of database searching and a lot of critical appraisal sessions. The other point is I didn't really have that much contact with students outside of that one standalone session. So the university had toyed with flipped learning a bit, but in reality, you couldn't send stuff to students and actually reliably say they're going to see it or look at it or plan based on that, because a lot wouldn't have. And similarly, I couldn't send them any post-session activities and rely on them to get completed. I basically had that time in that classroom to do stuff. I could send recordings and tutorials and give students tutorials, but it wouldn't be everybody because of timing. You couldn't see every student for a tutorial afterwards. So what does that sort of context and that reality of what my teaching looked like mean for me if I want to start being a critical teacher? Well, sort of, it's tricky, in short. It was difficult for me to do. There was a lot of content to cover, a lot of literature searching sessions, and I couldn't do a lot of the more critical stuff that I was really interested in. So I couldn't have that many discussions about power and knowledge justice and authority, about what trust means, because I was doing the nuts and bolts of sort of searching and information literacy. And I got really frustrated about that because I wanted to do more of the critical content. To the point really where I ended up sort of writing and teaching my own module for a couple of years to do that, but that's kind of aside from this. So if I didn't have much power to decide what I would teach, what I did choose to do instead was to focus on how I taught and try to get more critical in that sense instead. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about today for the rest of this session. So if we accept that when we're teaching, we have power over our students and in our classrooms, to be critical, we're going to need to think about how we express and how we use that power. Now, based on my reading and my understanding and sort of research into different critical practices, it really summed up for me to think about power in two different models. So the power of an authoritarian and the power of an authority. So how do they sort of differ and how do they express their power in different ways? So for an authoritarian, their power is almost always absolute and it extends across all areas that they're involved with. Whereas an authority's power is much more contextual. It only extends to specific situations, specific topics, and specific scenarios. An authoritarian's power is positional. They have power because of the position that they hold. So as a teacher, your power is there because you are the teacher, if you're in that authoritarian model. Whereas an authority, the power is much more relational. It's built on the relationship between yourselves and the learners. And they can choose whether or not to give you that power based on that relationship. They can reject it if they want to. An authoritarian's power is sort of intrinsic. It comes from that position and their ability to exert that power. So they have that power and can exert it on people because of who they are and the position that they hold. Whereas an authority's power is extrinsic. It's given to them. So somebody who's an authority only has power over them because people choose to follow them or choose to be influenced by them. And finally, sort of an authoritarian's power, it's exclusive, it's just theirs, and it's a zero sum. You can't really, as an authoritarian, share much power without diminishing your personal power. Whereas an authority can be much more accommodating. They can share power with people, even those who disagree, and it doesn't necessarily reduce their power. It's probably relatively easy to think about potential authoritarians, and that might be in a political sense, but also in our professional and personal lives. So you can think about authoritarian behaviours in managers that you've had or colleagues that you've had before, friends might behave in authoritarian ways, family members, and people that you have studied with before. I'm interested to see a little bit around who you think about as being an authority. So this is somebody who sort of you listen to, you follow, and you let influence you, but doesn't necessarily have formal power over you. So what I'd like to do is just get some suggestions from you who is an authority when it comes to you. So I'm going to give you, again, about a minute to do that in the chat. And I'm just really interested to see who is that authority for you, okay? So I'll just let you do that for about a minute. Okay, that's really interesting. So we've got a bit of a range of ones. Somewhere it's personal, somewhere it's more professional. So colleagues that we might work alongside, so they don't have a formal power over you, but they influence you because you respect them or they're more experienced. We've got, I think Maria said your mum, and Laura too, which is lovely. So yeah, definitely I would agree with that. I used to use, when I did this session before, I used to use as an example, the best example I could think of as an authority that I see was David Attenborough. I always thought, actually, good example of somebody who doesn't actually have a position of formal power, but when it comes to those certain areas around environmentalism, around biodiversity, has massive amounts of influence and power to affect change. Actually, I think the better example now, and apologies for anyone who isn't from the UK here, but a really good example I can think of now that I would use is Jack Monroe, the food writer and the anti-poverty campaigner, because they have no real formal position of power at all, and in many respects is actively depowered because of various things in their life and their experiences, but is hugely influential and has managed to affect massive change because of their integrity, because of their knowledge, because of their communication skills. And I think have been a really good example of an authority like that, because they have those that sort of knowledge in a particular area and the influence in that particular area. So that's who is my authority figure now, I think. So this kind of leads me on a little bit to what I want to do in my teaching, which is, how can I be an authority then? If I think that authority is okay, but authoritarian is bad, I do want to be a critical teaching librarian, and I can't control a lot of things about the context of my teaching, but I'm left trying to tread this rather difficult line between authority and authoritarianism. Particularly because so many of our educational experiences at a young age are in that very authoritarian model, that almost becomes your default. So how do I try and steer away from that into more of an authority, which I'm more comfortable with? So how have I gone about doing that? And I mean me here quite specifically, because this is what has worked for me. So the way that I've tried to resolve this is by using sort of democratic principles when I'm teaching. Now, to me, given my socio-cultural background, particularly as a white Westerner, democracy is how authority is legitimized. So therefore, if I can use democratic principles and practices, I feel much more comfortable about the authority that I have in the library classroom. And it helps me to try and avoid teaching in that authoritarian style. So when I'm writing and talking about democratic practice, I found it quite useful to break it into three themes. So consent, transparency, and accountability. And I'll sort of go through those now and sort of talk to you what I mean by those. So consent is probably the thing that we most associate with democracy and with democratic practice. Now, if it's a functioning democracy, and functioning is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that, if democracy is functioning properly, then we should, in theory, accept a government as having legitimate authority because they've gained the consent of the people via an election. So we might not like the people in power, we might not agree with them, we might want to remove them from power, but we should, in theory, accept their legitimacy in that position of authority because they've won an election. And because via that election or that vote, they've gained the consent of the people as a broader mass. The people then also have the option of withdrawing that consent, and that should remove a government from office at the next sort of electoral opportunity. So what might consent look like in an educational context? Now, in UK higher education, there are sort of obviously democratic structures in that place. We often have course reps that are voted on by their peers. We have society committees, we have SAB officers who run for their positions. But on a day-to-day basis, these aren't particularly influential when it comes to what happens in a classroom. And most teaching actually falls within a very sort of firmly non-participatory sort of ethos. So in order to be democratic, I wanted to bring more elements of consent into my practice. So I looked first at decision-making. So in my traditional authoritarian paradigm, most of the big decisions about my teaching input were made by me, perhaps with an academic. So we would make those together. So things like when and where the session would take place. So we would make those decisions. We'd look at a scheme of work over the course of a semester, and we'd pick out which week we were going to have the research session with me based on where we thought students should be at that point. So say, you know, they get the assessment at week 3, so we'll put the research session the week after because that's when they should be starting their research, blah, blah, blah. And we pick days and times based on what we thought was best for the students and what would be most convenient for them. And sort of spoiler alert, we were rarely right on that. Students' lives are really complicated and really varied between them with their different responsibilities. So instead, what I started to do was to consult with students directly and get them to help me decide on these things. So often what I do is give them options for different sessions and get them to vote on which was going to work best for them. Sometimes what I would do is schedule one session early in the semester for those that got their research done sort of along week by week, and another one later on for those who, the way that they worked was to cram at the end, because that's what worked for them. So I'd often have two. We'd often have different sessions with sign-ups so they could vote by which one they chose to attend to. And for one session that was a postgrad session for referencing, we almost sort of set up a kind of a petition. So rather than me trying to guess when they would need that input on referencing, I set up a voting sort of vote for them. And when they were struggling, they could vote. And once it reached a certain quota, that's when it would trigger me to go in and do that session with them. So hopefully it was at the point where most of them needed it. So we looked at that sort of decision making on timing using that sort of democratic method. Once we're actually in the classroom, I also looked at the input into what I'm actually teaching with the students. So there's some stuff, particularly as a health librarian, that just has to be covered in a session because it was part of their assessments. But there was almost always some choice in what I do or don't do and how much time I spend on different aspects of a topic. So I'd often get students to vote within the session about what they wanted me to focus on or what they want me to spend more time on. So should it be database searching or subject headings or citation searching? And they could choose out of those which they wanted me to do or to focus on. I often used a sort of model where we do a must, should, and could. So the things that I decided we absolutely had to cover, the stuff the students wanted me to cover, and then stuff that would have been nice, but we don't have time to do. So I'm going to refer to something on that afterwards. And I would often plan an extra sort of 10 minutes into a session and give students a choice of different things I could cover with them at the end. For newer students as well, I often thought about what different types of information seeking they might want support with. So in the traditional sense, we could have that very librarian approved, step-by-step, thorough search, and I could take them through that if they wanted me to. Or I could give them advice on a sort of quick and dirty search. So how to find the information quickly, but maybe not as thoroughly. And we'll cover the more sort of systematic searching later in the course. But right now you want something basic and simple. And I would do that with them if they wanted me to. And finally, I've often used consent when it comes to sort of teaching methods. So this might be asking students, do you want a more practical, hands-on, intensive session? Or do you want something which is more demonstration-led, where you're observing me, it's recorded and you can try it out in your own time? If I'm assigning an activity, I often let them self-select whether they want to work individually, in pairs or in groups, because it really doesn't matter to me and it's what's comfortable for them. And sometimes I've set up sort of carousel activities where students can self-select which they go to. So that might be based on different topics, different techniques, or it might be on levels of complexity, something like database search. So a basic one, a more advanced one, and then a very advanced one. And students can self-select which they go to, so they have a choice in what they do. So that's sort of the consent element, but if a society is going to be democratic, it's not just enough to hold a vote every few years. The citizenry also need accurate information to know what the government has done, how well it's performed, and what they plan to do if we're going to re-elect them. And by contrast, authoritarian regimes restrict information. It's highly controlled and it's censored, and you only get one line on things, which I think is, something that is really obvious to us at the moment. So in terms of sort of democratic teaching, transparency is probably the area that I am most in favour of advocating. And I think this comes down a lot to my experience of higher education. So as a first generation student in higher education, I often felt that a huge amount of information that you needed to succeed was either withheld or it was dependent on cultural capital that I did not have. Or it needed really sharp elbows. So you had to really work to try and get the information that you needed. And I never felt confident in doing that. So, and quite often information was sort of intentionally withheld from you because there's this guise that you have to develop as an independent learner. So we're not going to tell you what you need to know. We're going to expect you to go and find it yourself, even if I could help you. And that, for me, as a new student, as a new undergraduate, that was really damaging, and I found that really difficult. So I'm all in favour of being more transparent in education. So in education, teachers are often in control of much or all of the information that's out there. And that doesn't just mean subject knowledge, it also means the broader contextual information present in education. So take, for instance, a typical research skills session that you've planned. You've got an hour with the students and you make choices about what you do and what you don't include within that time. So you might include searching the library catalogue, searching a database, but you don't cover anything about source integration, referencing, source evaluation, anything like that. Now that might be based on really sound professional judgment, but the student in the class probably doesn't know the things that you've chosen to exclude. They might not know that that's something that you could have done, but you chose not to. And they probably might not have that sort of metacognition to even know what they don't know, or have the vocabulary in order to find that information out independently. So to try and remedy this, I started to be really explicit at the start of lessons about what I'd chosen to include and what I'd chosen and actively not put into the session because of time or other constraints. And then I could sort of say to students, well, this is the stuff I'm not covering with you, so you'll need to find this yourself. Here's some starting points to find it, and here's what you should be looking for when you're on there. I also carry out that transparency into any activities that I set. So I try to give the rationale for why I'm using a particular method. So if I have instructed people to work in pairs or in groups, I might explain that actually it's really important for them that they don't just hear my perspective, they need the perspective of their peers. So it's not just a random decision to put them in groups, it's not for my convenience, there is a reason behind that. Also, if I'm using something like questioning, asking questions to the group, I try not to just throw a question out there, but actually try to explain why I'm asking that question. So to say that this is to check your comprehension, I want to make sure you've understood the point I've just made, or that I'm actively seeking alternative viewpoints, or that by asking you that question and by you forming an answer to it, I'm hoping that's going to clarify your thoughts on a particular issue. Final bit of this in terms of transparency is I want to be transparent with students about where my authority comes from. I don't want my students to feel like they should listen to me or take my advice just because it's me standing at the front of the room and they're sat down in chairs in front of me. So to do that, I would often talk about my experiences in the past and where I'm coming from. So that doesn't mean sort of reading through my CV and saying I've got these qualifications, but I talk about how I spend lots of time with students and I get to know what the common problems are or what we often struggle with. And that means that I'm well equipped to help you. I would also talk about some of the issues that I've had in the past. So I could never ever get referencing right until I was at sort of master's level. And I still make mistakes all the time. So I can use that in order to sort of bridge that boundary between me and the students and say it's difficult and it's something that for some people is always hard to do. And also things like academic voice. If I'm ever talking about academic writing and finding your academic voice, that I don't feel comfortable with it either. It's not just you, it's something that we all struggle with. So overall, thinking about that sort of transparency piece, I think it's been more useful, not just in terms of my classroom practice, so what I'm doing in front of students, but also just that act of when I'm planning sessions and when I'm thinking what I'm going to do, having to think about how I would justify this to students and what reasons I would give for doing something helps to make me a more critical teacher and a more reflective teacher as well. This. Okay, and the last sort of theme I wanted to touch on is about accountability. So if consent means that people get a choice in selecting who's in power, and transparency means we know what they're doing and we have the information we need, accountability is that ability to remove an authority from power if they prove to be ineffective, dishonest, unpopular. This means that, in theory, unlike authoritarian regimes, transfers of power in a functioning democracy should be generally peaceful. There is an accepted method of doing that, of holding people to account and removing them from power. So you don't tend to have, you shouldn't always have palace coups and stuff like that in democracy. Now, it would be obviously impractical for students to sort of vote out and replace a teacher partway through a course or a module. And I don't think that's something that we would want to have. I wouldn't want to be in front of a group of students and they vote me off the island partway through teaching them. But students do, of course, do that in effect because they vote with their feet. They choose not to show up at certain sessions, or they leave poor feedback on module evaluations. But I don't think these are particularly positive instances, and they don't really do much to change that student's actual experience of their learning. You can leave terrible feedback for a module, but it's not going to help you. It might help somebody else in the future, but that's no good for you. So I've tried to reflect on ways that I can make myself more accountable to my students when I'm teaching. And one way I've looked at is to sort of actively offer alternatives to the sessions that I've delivered. So I'll openly acknowledge that for some of the people in the room with me when I'm teaching, this lesson might not have worked. It might not have been effective. You might have found it boring. You might have found it too complex. You might have found it just not the right time and space for you to learn this content. And by acknowledging that and saying that's okay, that's normal. I wouldn't expect 30 people to have an identical experience for anything, let alone a lesson. So then I can talk about offering alternatives. So if this didn't work for you, what can you do about it? Well, you can book tutorials, you could look at some online content that's been produced, you could look at the recordings again and practice, and you can sort of get the learning that way instead. And this, I hope, makes clear to the students that if the lesson didn't work for them, that's not necessarily a fault on their part. It's just that not every lesson suits every learner, and it's normal. I also try and incorporate challenges to my authority within the session as well. So I don't mean sort of inviting people to sort of disrupt the session, but actually to offer alternative viewpoints and to not necessarily go along with what I'm saying, or to offer sort of alternatives. I think it's quite difficult for students educated within that sort of authoritarian paradigm, which, to be fair, is most of us really, to embrace that challenge, particularly if they don't have that long-standing relationship with you. If you've been taught by the same person for 13, 14 weeks, develop that relationship, it's easier to have a more challenging conversation, or where you're offering up an alternative viewpoint. But we don't tend to have that as librarians. I also think most students are sort of conditioned to look for the right answer. So when they're asked a question, do they, even if it's framed as, I want your opinion, they're looking for the acceptable opinion that the teacher wants, rather than their true opinion or perspective on something. And that's something that's really hard to break, I think. So I've looked at different ways of trying to make this a bit easier. So particularly when I'm using questioning, I try to create some distance between my opinions and perspectives and those of the students, so that they feel more comfortable expressing themselves honestly. So instead of directly inviting somebody to give me an alternative viewpoint, I might display a range of different viewpoints on the board and say, what do you identify most closely with? And then take it from there, so that it's not just them challenging me directly, they've got an easier way of doing that. And then we can sort of follow that up if we want to. When I'm questioning, I try to sort of build up trust with the students by starting off with simpler closed questions and then moving on to open questions afterwards. That helps to break the ice a little bit between us. And sometimes I also use what's called bouncing technique. So you start off with one student and ask them a question, and then you ask somebody else to respond to that point, and on and on. And it just creates that distance between the two of us, so that they're talking across each other rather than always just responding to what I've said. Okay, so I think that's everything that I had to say in this. I never quite know how to finish sessions like this, so I'm just going to leave it as there, as that's your lot. But I think we do have a few minutes if anybody has any questions. So I'm just going to come off of the share. And if you do have questions, you can pop them into the chat, or feel free to pop your hand up and we can unmute you. I'm also, just while you're doing that, going to let the cat out because he's screaming at me at the moment. Sorry. Oh, thank you, Andrew. That's really kind of you to say about transparency. I can see a question around what sort of percentage of people voted on things. So if I'm doing the session and I've asked people to vote on when we're going to hold it, or when it's going to be, it depends a little bit on what the sort of format for that was. So if it's about, picking from a selection of sessions, we generally get most people doing that because they would need to go to one of them, but they would have that choice there. If it was something like saying when they wanted that referencing support, I would probably say, I used to set a benchmark of about 50%. So when about 50% of people have said, yes, I need help with this, that's when it would trigger it. And I was quite comfortable with that because I thought they're probably the ones that are struggling the most at that moment.
I think Simon has a question as well. Simon, if you want to just unmute your mic.
Yeah, thanks. I'm not very good at typing, so I thought I'd just do it this way. When you talked about kind of like when you are just getting those one-shot sessions and things like that, how do you go about reconciling kind of trying to get them to get as much into the sessions as they need with that approach? Because oftentimes, you feel like you're really up against the time limit, and so it's really interesting where the students want to take it, but there's so much more that you've got to pack in, and it's really hard not to then go, we can't do this now, can we do it later, sort of thing. That feels a little bit kind of like shutting them down, and I have done that and I hate doing it, and it's I just wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, and I think it's something that we do have, if you're given an hour to take somebody through how to do a systematized literature review, it's really hard because there is so much that you want to cover. I mean, I think the way that I used to do that sort of, must, could, should, and try and keep a little bit of space there. I think fundamentally, if you need your full hour to teach what you need to teach them, because that's in your professional judgment, then you go with that. Because I think everything that I've said here, I wouldn't throw all of that into a single session because I think it would just be too much anyway. But in that case, what I would probably do then is cover what I've decided needs to be covered, but then use that sort of transparency thing. So these are things we didn't get to do actually. And then hopefully you've got some resources, or you can refer people to other ways of teaching those. So if that sounds like a bit of a cop-out question answer, that's probably how I would, but we have to be realistic about what we can do in that time, I think.
Fair enough, thank you.
I can see a question in the chat. So I think Laurie said, can I ask for some more information on the technique you use to enable students to vote on when a certain session would happen? So if it was something like a searching session, if it was just a choice of when within a particular week or something like that, you want me to teach them, because particularly for health students, a lot of them are on placements and a lot of care and responsibilities. I'll just do something simple like a doodle poll and just say, okay, tell me when you're going to do it, when you want it, and I'll schedule it for that time. If it was one where it was more like almost that, where the quota had been reached, I just used a Google form for that. And when I'd got a certain number of responses, that's when I would trigger and I would do that. So I think there was probably about 30 students in the class. I sent them all the link, said, look, when you are struggling with your referencing, this is what to do. Put your name into this, and then I will sort out a session for you and do it that way. I can see a question that just says about asking students to make decisions about what, when, how content is covered, that it could be perceived as extracting their labour or putting additional burden and stress on them, and how we negotiate that. Yeah, I mean, I think it fundamentally does give them extra work to do. I think in the particular context that I was doing this, it was that framing about the purpose behind it and what the reason was for that. Particularly with the students that I was working with in that role, they had very complex lives and a lot were commuter students, and that was something that's really important for them, because finding the right time to teach them was really hard, particularly if anything was ever going to be off their core timetable. So some of them were traveling in, you know, maybe an hour and a half drive in. So it was always framed as that, and finding the right time for you. So this is about you expressing a preference in order to tell me when you want me to teach you, because often half an hour delay at the end of their day to do something else could trigger, you know, a 3-hour commute then because of train times or traffic and stuff like that. So I sort of negotiated it that way, and that I'm doing this sort of for your convenience and for your benefit. I can see there's one other question about, in my experience, how have academics reacted to allowing students to input on the content of the session? A lot of the time, I don't particularly invite academics to be in the room when I'm teaching. I like to be me and the students. And it's something that I would just do. I would say I'm covering the core content that I've decided on, but there's so much other stuff I want them to be able to choose it. I don't think I ever had a negative reaction to that. But then they might not have known I was doing it a lot of the time. Okay, well, I think we're just about out of time there. But thank you very much, everybody. If you do want to ever get in touch with me or discuss anything else, I'll pop my email in the chat, and do feel free to give me a shout, either on over email or on Twitter.